Hello, YouTube. Suicide for Celluloid here. Um, I'm making this video in an unusually freeform way. I don't. I normally think about bullet points and things, um, but this time around, I'm just gonna kind of go for it. Um, and the reason why is because I don't necessarily have like. I think this particular issue is really difficult, and the issue at hand is the issue of race, right? And Theo Warner posted a video uh, in relation to um, a, an ongoing sort of argument that he's been having. And I agree with almost everything in it, but something snagged my attention in there that I want to unpack and um, kind of play with a little bit. And that's the idea of being post racial, right? Um, we should behave in such a way as if race is not an issue. Um, and this strikes me as being difficult. Um, in fact, everything about the conversation of race is difficult to me. Um, any statement about race is difficult, and that's in part because I'm a white male, right? Um, uh, my perspective, like I feel like racism, the topic of racism, becomes extremely important for white people to think about, um, because because we are the hegemonic, you know, race in this culture, um, and so immediately there's always, danger, I guess. Danger comes along with hegemony by definition. Um, so I think it's required to take extra special care um, when one is hegemonic. So this notion of behaving in a post-racial way is tough for me. And it's tough for me because one thing that we just can't seem to do in America, one thing that we like really have a problem with is having an adult conversation about race, right? Um, it's an important conversation to have, um, and it's also a problematic conversation to have because race is something that we in America get particularly squeamish about because of our history, right? We have a particularly racially charged history. Um, because that's something we get squeamish about, uh, we can't. We label the conversation as being essentially a taboo, and then as a result, um, it racism functions beneath the surface, right? Or at least it seems to me to be beneath the surface in most cases. It's certainly not. It's certainly much more pervasive at a subsurface level. It's very rare that you will encounter people who are perfectly willing to be openly racist. Um, and even people who are anti racist uh, or feel themselves to be anti racist, um, can adopt racist positions, racist language without meaning to, right? Um, not in the sense of slurs, but ways of talking. Um, uh, you see this a lot in like older liberals will often will often talk about black people in America as being um, almost like, oh, it's not their fault, right? We have to help them out, etc. And you end up in this really like almost worse position of like you're trying to help, um, but you're really just propagating um, racism essentially. um, and I think that the idea of behaving in a post-racial way is dangerous, and particularly it's dangerous for white people to adopt this attitude. I think um, for that reason, for the reason that it becomes there become a whole plethora of ways to be racist without being racist, right? And and I think that these are things that need to be analyzed and confronted, um, and dealt with. Um, now, first of all, my position on race, my perhaps my most primary position on race, is that it's an example of what Marx calls false consciousness, right? It's in America, the conversation about race has obliterated conversations about class and economic inequalities, poverty, and such. Um, that's dangerous, right? It's dangerous when you have people whose interests are in line with one another, butting heads. You know, particularly like the white working class in America and the black working class in America. It's a horrible thing for them to be butting heads over old prejudices when, uh, by all rights, they should entirely be allies. I think that this is sort of a function of control that the conversation about race has. Um, I think that there still is in the country um, a, a curious and problematic identification um, between Black America and poverty. Um, and I mean, like, obviously, you know, the black population is disproportionately poor, right? Like, obviously, there is a racial dimension to that. But in some way, like, I feel like that's not the important thing to address. You know, the important thing to address is poverty itself. Um, and so I think there's a real danger in the discourse surrounding race in America. Um, so that's my first concern with with uh, with race as a discourse, and this is true about sexual orientation, right? As well, this is true about plenty of things, and I'm not saying that minority groups shouldn't be struggling for their rights and for equality. Um, but what I am saying is that it's a problem for the issue of minority rights to entirely eclipse class relations. That's an issue, I think. Now, the second thing that I find interesting, Judith Butler has this idea. She wrote in her book Gender Trouble. She has this idea of gender as being a performative thing. It's something that we do rather than something that we are. And the idea is that we walk in certain ways, we talk in certain ways, so as to consolidate the image of myself as a man. We dress in certain ways, etc. Um, uh, and I mean, I don't think that this is problematic to say. I think that this is especially true within. Obviously, I'm not trying to construct a stereotype, but I think within the discourse of homosexuality in America, within the gay rights movement, or gay culture, it's very clear that there's sort of a discourse that operates around this idea of cultivating a a collection of behaviors and cultivating an appearance and a certain set of mannerisms that identify one as being gay. And I think it's, you know, the reason why I bring it up in terms of gay rights is because I think that it's probably less controversial to say that than it would be to say the same thing about being black, right, or being Latino or something like that. And again, I'm not saying that like all gay people do this. I'm not saying that all black people do this. All Latino people do this, right? But I think that it's problematic to deny that there is sort of a socially constructed role that functions within society, and that people attempt to cultivate the image of that role for one reason or another. Often just to identify with something, right? Like that's a big deal. I remember a friend of mine who was Jewish became much more involved in his Jewish community, basically, and in his words, it was due to the fact that there was a community that he could identify with. That's a good thing. Um, I'm not saying that any of this is bad. It's important to note. I just think that it. I also think that it's less controversial to say about gay people because gay culture has always been around, right? But mainstream gay culture, or the idea of a mainstream gay culture, kind of just exploded in a flash of, if we're talking on historical timescales. Um, it happened really fast and really abruptly, the coming out movement. And as a result, I think that that discourse contains a certain uh, it's just much more obvious that this is something that the gay community is doing, rather than something that this is, rather than something that the gay community are. Um, and I'm not saying that they're acting. I'm not saying that there's a cynical dimension to it. I'm saying that there's a certain image, or we should say certain set of images that are sort of cultivated within that. Um, so this is my second idea of race. Like I think that this is important to think about. We should think about race in part as being a socially constructed norm that people consolidate the image of. Um, and that's true about being a white male also, I think. This is an important an important piece of the conversation about race. Um, but at the same time, there's another piece about it which might perhaps contradict that, which is that I, as a white male, well, I think that there's a problem in a sort of naive post racism. I'm not accusing Theo of this, obviously, but in people who would talk about race in this way. I think that there's a tendency to say things like, I don't see color, or something like that. And I think that that's a problem. I think that there is an otherness implicit in being a member of another race, or identifying oneself, because we should understand, like, I don't really believe that race exists as like a biological category, um, but there is an element of other, like, if I see a black guy, and I prefer that term to African Americans, by the way. I think it's much more, um, uh, I wouldn't want to assume, if I see a black guy on the street, I wouldn't want to assume that he is of African descent, because that's not sure. And I don't want to assume that he's American. So that's a caveat in the language. So I just prefer to use the term black person, and I hope that that's not offensive. Um, I think that there is an otherness present in that, and I would say this about, I am a male. I think that's true about if I encounter a female, right? Um, there's, like, I don't know what it's like to have the experiences of a black man. I don't know what it's like to have the experiences of a female, right? Um, I That's not my life. That's not my history. That's not who I am. I cannot relate to that set of experiences. So there is an otherness, and that otherness is of value, right? It's not a bad thing that there's an otherness, but that otherness needs to be, recognized. Um, it needs to be thought about. It needs to be engaged with. Um, this idea that deep down we're all the same, regardless of what race you are. This is more like, this is dangerous. Actually, I think, um, it's a way of hiding the issue, and the issue, one central issue of race, is not the issue of, or is the issue of how we deal with others, right? Even if I see another white male, there's an element of otherness. If I see another person, there's an element of otherness. But that otherness comes out in much more stark relief when I encounter somebody of a different race, or a different gender, or a different sexual orientation. Um, and I think it's important to recognize, no, I am different from these people. Um, I am different from others. Um, and that's that's true about everyone. And I think that the trick isn't to deny that, but the trick is to stand, um, in a more healthy relationship to that, right? So this goes back to this notion. I said before, deep down inside, we're all, the same, or the more new agey version, we are all one, right? this is dangerous. I think it's a longing for homogeneity in society. It's a longing for unity, right? Like these are the principles. I mean, if you radicalize this, it becomes and introduce severe violence and such. It's the basis for classical racism. Actually, the notion that everybody, we'd all be better off in homogeneous communities where we all were white and Christian and blah 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 blah. Like, saying we're all one seems to me to be a thinly veiled reactionary position, um, because the form is changed, but the essence remains the same. I think that no, we need to accept that we are not all one. We are seven some point something billion, right? All different. Um, that many others, that many kinds of other, um, and that's not a problem. But I don't think it's as easy as saying that we should all behave as if race wasn't an issue. Um, and I don't know. Maybe in saying that, I don't think in saying anything that I've said. I think it would be difficult for somebody to construe what I've said as being a racist set of statements. Uh, I hope it's not. I know that this is a very sensitive issue. Um, and I know that I haven't necessarily presented a coherent view, and perhaps have presented multiple mutually exclusive ideas, but I haven't really, it's a very big topic, and I haven't exactly worked it out or really spent the time working it out that I should. Um, so that's all just food for thought, I guess, on the debate, on the debate about race, and also, like, of course, Theo, like, I know that, like, yes, if I'm in an argument